He knew Mexico territory baked under a sun that showed no mercy. Heat rose from the red earth in visible waves, distorting the horizon until it looked like water that would never quench a man's thirst. Samuel Bridger stood at the edge of his property, squinting at land that stretched so far it made a man feel small. But Samuel had felt small for 8 years now, ever since cholera swept through and took his wife and infant son in the same week. He was 43 years old, though his face looked older. Deep lines carved around his eyes from years of squinting at the sun. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who had worked every day of his adult life. Before the sickness came, he'd been a different man. He'd sung while he worked. He'd made plans. He'd talked about building a bigger house, about having more children, about growing old with Mary at his side. Now he was just a man who woke up, worked, and went to bed. Nothing more. The ranch sat 15 miles outside of Socorro, a town he visited once a month for supplies and nothing else. He never stayed for drinks. Never lingered to hear gossip. Never looked at the few unmarried women who occasionally glanced his way. 8 years without a woman's touch, without a woman's voice in his home, without even a woman's shadow crossing his doorstep. The townspeople had stopped trying to reach him after the 3rd year. They'd brought casseroles at first, offered prayers, suggested he might find comfort in church or company. But Samuel had built walls higher than any structure on his property, walls made of silence and distance. His ranch sprawled across 200 acres of scrubland. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. He raised cattle, enough to keep him fed and clothed with a little left over. He had 4 horses, 2 dozen chickens, and a mule named Jasper who was meaner than a rattlesnake but loyal. The house itself was small, just 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace and a bedroom he rarely used. Most nights he fell asleep in his chair by the fire, too tired or too numb to move. Every morning was the same. Wake before dawn. Make coffee so strong it could strip paint. Check the animals. Ride out to survey the cattle. Mend whatever needed mending. Return at dusk. Eat something simple, usually beans or dried meat. Sit by the fire. Sleep. Repeat. He told himself he preferred it this way. No complications. No heartache. No risk of loss because there was nothing left to lose. The land couldn't leave him. The cattle couldn't die in his arms. The silence couldn't break his heart because his heart was already broken. But on that particular evening in late June, as the sun began its slow descent and painted the sky in shades of copper and gold, something changed. Samuel was in the stable, brushing down his gelding, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the usual sounds of his property, the creak of wood or the rustle of wind through sparse grass. This was different. Voices. Faint, but unmistakable. Female voices. He froze, brush in hand, listening. His heart began to pound, not from fear but from something closer to panic. Women. Here. On his land. It couldn't be. No one came out this far, especially not women traveling alone. He set down the brush slowly, wiped his hands on his worn trousers, and walked toward the sound. Each step felt heavy, reluctant. He'd built his isolation carefully, brick by brick, day by day. He didn't want it disturbed. As he rounded the corner of the stable, he saw them. 4 figures in the fading light, moving slowly across his property from the east. They were still 100 yards away, but he could make out their forms. Women, definitely. And from their clothing and the way they moved, Navajo. Samuel's jaw tightened. He knew what this meant. Trouble. The government had been rounding up Navajo families for years, forcing them onto reservations, sometimes worse. If these women were out here alone, they were running from something. And if they were running, someone might be following. He should turn around. Go back to his stable. Pretend he'd never seen them. Let them pass through his land and disappear into the desert. It wasn't his problem. He'd made it a point not to have problems. But he didn't move. The women drew closer. He could see now that they were struggling. One of them was limping badly, supported by two others. The fourth walked slightly ahead, scanning the landscape with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust the world. When they were close enough to see him clearly, they stopped. The one in front, an older woman with gray threading through her long black hair, raised her hand in a gesture that was neither greeting nor surrender, just acknowledgement. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the distant cry of a hawk. Samuel studied them. They were exhausted, that much was clear. Dust covered their clothing. Their faces were drawn. The injured one looked barely conscious. The older woman spoke first. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't had water in too long. "Please. We need help." Samuel's throat felt tight. He hadn't spoken to a woman in 8 years. Hadn't wanted to. Hadn't needed to. But looking at them now, at their desperation, at the injured woman swaying on her feet, he felt something crack inside him. Not break, just crack. Like ice beginning to thaw. He didn't answer. Couldn't find words. But he jerked his head toward the house and started walking. Behind him, after a pause, he heard footsteps following. He led them to the house, pushed open the door, and gestured inside. The interior was sparse, masculine, untouched by any decorative hand for 8 years. The older woman helped the injured one inside first, lowering her onto Samuel's cot in the corner. The other two followed, moving with the careful politeness of people who knew they were intruding. Samuel went to his well, drew fresh water, and brought it inside in a bucket with his least dented tin cups. He set it down without a word and walked back outside. His heart was hammering. His hands shook slightly. He'd let them in. After 8 years of letting no one in, he'd opened his door to 4 strangers in less than 5 minutes. He stood on his porch, breathing hard, wondering what he'd just done. Inside, he could hear soft voices, the sound of water being poured, a quiet moan from the injured woman. He should go back in. Should ask what happened. Should find out if someone was following them. Should establish some kind of understanding about how long they'd stay. But he couldn't make himself move. Instead, he walked to the stable, saddled his horse, and rode out to check his cattle. He rode for 2 hours, long past when he needed to, using the time to think. Or rather, to avoid thinking. When he finally returned, night had fallen completely. His house glowed with lamplight, and for the first time in 8 years, it looked lived in. He approached slowly, unsaddled his horse, and stood outside his own door for a full minute before entering. The scene inside stopped him in his tracks. The injured woman lay on his cot, her leg bandaged with strips torn from someone's dress. The older woman sat beside her, applying what looked like a poultice. The other two had been busy. His floor, which he couldn't remember sweeping in months, was clean. His dishes, usually left until he ran out of clean ones, were washed and stacked. A pot sat over the fire, something inside that smelled better than anything he'd cooked in years. They all looked up when he entered. He stood awkwardly in the doorway of his own home, unsure what to do or say. The older woman stood. "Thank you," she said simply. "For your kindness." Samuel nodded once. He moved to the fireplace, poured himself coffee from the pot he'd left that morning, now somehow cleaned and refilled. He sat in his chair, the only chair, and stared into the fire. The women returned to their tasks. No one spoke. But the silence felt different than the silence Samuel was used to. That silence had been empty, hollow. This silence was full, alive with presence. After a while, the older woman brought him a bowl. He looked down at it. Some kind of stew, thick and fragrant. He hadn't asked for it. Hadn't expected it. But his hands took the bowl anyway. "Thank you," he managed. His voice came out rough, unused. She nodded and returned to the others. Samuel ate slowly. The food was good, better than good. Each bite seemed to remind his body of things it had forgotten. That food could taste like something. That warmth could come from more than just fire. That a house could hold more than one person's loneliness. When he finished, he set the bowl down and finally spoke again. "The injured one. Will she be all right?" The older woman looked over. "Yes. She twisted her ankle badly running. It will heal." "Running from what?" The woman's face hardened. "Men. Government men. They came to our camp 2 weeks ago. Said we had to move to a new reservation. But we'd heard stories about that place. People who go there don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all." Samuel nodded slowly. He'd heard stories too. The government's treatment of the Navajo had been brutal, getting worse each year. "So you ran?" "We ran. Been moving mostly at night. But they're tracking us. We've seen their scouts." "How many?" "At least 6. Maybe more." Samuel looked into the fire. 6 men. Probably armed. Definitely determined. He should tell them to leave. Should put them back outside his walls before trouble arrived. It was the smart thing. The safe thing. Instead he said, "You can stay." The woman blinked. "Stay? Until the injured one can walk properly. Few days at least." He stood, set his cup down. "I've got blankets in the other room. I'll bring them out. You 4 take the cot and the floor. I'll sleep in the stable." "You don't have to." "I do," he cut her off. "It's your space now. For a few days." He gathered blankets, distributed them without meeting anyone's eyes, and left before anyone could argue or thank him further. The stable was cooler, dustier, but familiar. He made a bed in an empty stall and lay down, staring at the gaps in the roof where stars showed through. What was he doing? In 8 years he'd successfully avoided any meaningful human contact. He'd built his fortress of solitude and defended it against all comers. And now, in one evening, he'd let 4 strangers into not just his home but his life. He told himself it was temporary. A few days. An act of basic human decency. Nothing more. But as he lay there, listening to the horses breathe and the night sounds of the desert, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Purpose. Not the mindless purpose of daily chores, but real purpose. Someone needed him. Someone might depend on him. It was terrifying and, somehow, a little bit thrilling. He didn't sleep well that night. Kept imagining he heard hoofbeats in the distance. Kept seeing strangers approaching his property with weapons drawn. But morning came peacefully. He rose stiff and sore, fed the animals, and approached the house with trepidation. The women were already awake. They'd made coffee. Fixed breakfast from his meager supplies, somehow making it stretch further and taste better than he'd managed in months. They moved around his space with quiet efficiency, careful not to disturb but no longer timid. The older woman saw him and nodded. "Good morning." "Morning," he replied. "I'm Ioni," she said. "This is Nayeli, Izusa, and Kai." She gestured to each in turn. The injured one, Kai, raised her hand weakly from the cot. "We never asked your name." "Samuel." "Samuel Bridger." "Thank you, Samuel Bridger. For everything." He nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, and went to check on his cattle. When he returned several hours later, he found more changes. Someone had mended the tears in his curtains. The porch had been swept. His tools, usually scattered wherever he'd last used them, were organized. It continued that way. Each day he'd leave for his work, and each day he'd return to find small improvements. Kai's ankle healed slowly. The women settled into routines that complemented his own. They spoke little, mostly to each other in Navajo. But occasionally Ioni would translate something, share something, bridge the gap between his silence and theirs. 3 days passed. Then 5. Then a week. The injured woman could walk now, with a limp but without help. Samuel knew they could leave. Knew he should probably suggest it, for their safety and his. But he didn't. And they didn't offer. On the 8th day, Samuel rode out early to check fence lines on his northern boundary. The sun was barely up, the air still cool. He'd been riding for about an hour when he saw them. Fresh horse tracks, at least 5 or 6 animals, coming from the northeast and heading directly toward his property. His blood ran cold. He turned his horse and rode hard back to the ranch. When he arrived, the women were outside, washing clothes at the well. They looked up at his approach, saw his face, and understood immediately. "They're coming," Ioni said. It wasn't a question. "Looks like it. Tracks heading straight here. Maybe an hour behind me." The 4 women exchanged glances. Nayeli, the youngest, began to cry silently. Izusa put her arm around her. Kai, still limping, straightened her back with determination. Ioni looked at Samuel. "We'll go. Lead them away from here. You've done enough." "No," Samuel said, surprising himself with his firmness. "You'll stay. I'll talk to them. They won't listen to talk. These men, they don't see us as people. We're property to them. Problems to solve. Then I'll solve it differently." "Samuel." I said no. He dismounted, led his horse to the stable. "Get inside. Stay away from the windows. And whatever happens, don't come out unless I call for you." He went to the house, pulled out his rifle from where it hung above the door. Checked the action. Loaded it. He also strapped on his pistol, the one he rarely wore anymore. Then he took a position on the porch, rifle across his lap, and waited. They came just before noon. 6 riders, exactly as he'd estimated. They rode in formation, spread out, professional. These weren't random trackers. They were organized, experienced. The lead rider, a thick-shouldered man with a badge glinting on his vest, raised his hand. The group stopped about 30 yards from the house. Close enough to talk, far enough to react if things went wrong. "Afternoon," the man called. His voice carried easily in the still air. "Name's Marshal Grayson. Looking for some women. Navajo. 4 of them. You seen anyone matching that description?" Samuel sat still, rifle visible but not aimed. "Haven't seen anyone." Grayson smiled without warmth. "That so? Because we've tracked them directly to this property. Unless you've got ghosts living here, I think you're lying. Think what you want. I'm telling you I haven't seen them." Another rider, younger, with cruel eyes, spoke up. "We could search the place. Wouldn't take but a minute." "You could try," Samuel said quietly. The tension shifted. Grayson held up a hand to quiet his man. "Now hold on. No need for threats. We're officers of the law, acting under government authority. Those women are fugitives. Hiding them is a federal crime. Is that what you call them? Fugitives?" Samuel's voice was steady. "Or are they just people who don't want to be put in camps? What they want isn't relevant. They're wards of the state now. It's for their own protection." "Protection from what?" "From themselves. From starving. From wandering into trouble. Grayson's patience was wearing thin. "Look, old man, I don't have time for philosophy. Hand them over or move aside so we can retrieve them." Samuel stood slowly. "No. No. That's right. No. You want to search my property, you come back with a warrant. Until then, you're trespassing." The cruel-eyed rider laughed. "Trespassing? We're federal marshals. We don't need—" "I don't care if you're the president himself," Samuel interrupted. "This is my land. You're not welcome on it. Turn around and leave." Grayson's face hardened. "You're making a serious mistake. Wouldn't be my first. You understand we can arrest you? Charge you with obstruction, harboring fugitives? You can try that too." The 6 men exchanged glances. They hadn't expected resistance. Certainly not from one aging rancher. But Samuel's stance was clear. He wasn't bluffing. Wasn't backing down. Grayson leaned forward in his saddle. "Last chance. We can do this easy or hard." Samuel raised his rifle, not pointing it at anyone specifically but making his intentions clear. "Then I guess we're doing it hard." For a long moment, nobody moved. 6 armed men against 1. The math was simple. But something in Samuel's eyes, something hard and certain, gave them pause. This wasn't a man who feared death. Maybe because he'd been half dead for 8 years already. Finally, Grayson straightened. "We'll be back. With more men. With warrants. And when we come back, this conversation will go very differently." "I'll be here," Samuel said. The marshals turned their horses and rode off, slowly, maintaining formation. Making a show of not being intimidated even though something had clearly shifted. Samuel watched until they disappeared, then lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. The door opened behind him. Ione emerged, followed by the others. They'd watched through gaps in the curtains. Seen everything. "You shouldn't have done that," Ione said softly. "Now they'll come back with more men. They'll hurt you." Samuel turned to look at her. "Maybe. But they won't hurt you. Not while I'm breathing." "Why?" Nayeli asked, tears still on her cheeks. "Why would you risk this for us? You don't even know us." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he said, 8 years ago, I lost everything. My wife. My son. The life I thought I'd have. I told myself I was done. Done caring. Done connecting. Done being part of anything bigger than just surviving each day. He looked at each of them. "But these past days, with you here, something changed. This place feels like a home again. I didn't realize how much I missed that. How much I'd let die inside me." He shook his head. "So maybe I'm not doing this just for you. Maybe I'm doing it for me too. Because for the first time in 8 years, I feel alive." Ione stepped forward. She reached out slowly and placed her hand on his arm. A simple touch, but the first deliberate human contact Samuel had experienced in nearly a decade. It felt like electricity. "Then we fight together," she said. Samuel wanted to argue. Wanted to send them away for their own safety. But looking at Ione's determined face, at the others standing behind her, he understood something. They weren't helpless. They weren't victims. They'd survived running across miles of desert. They'd evaded trackers for weeks. They had strength he was only beginning to see. Together, he agreed. The rest of that day was spent preparing. Samuel showed them his weapons, 3 rifles and 2 pistols total. He taught Azusa and Nayeli the basics of loading and firing. Kai, still limping, couldn't run but insisted on learning to shoot from a stationary position. Ione, it turned out, already knew. She'd lost a husband years before, killed in a raid, and had learned to defend herself afterward. They fortified what they could. Moved heavy furniture near windows. Filled barrels with water in case of fire. Made plans for different scenarios. If the marshals came back with overwhelming force, the women would flee out the back while Samuel held them off. If they tried to burn them out, they'd retreat to the root cellar. If they laid siege, they had enough food and water for several days. As the sun set, they ate together. Simple food, but it felt almost ceremonial. Sharing a meal before potential battle. Samuel found himself studying his companions. Really seeing them for the first time. Ione was probably 50, her face lined but strong. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd worked hard her entire life. There was sadness in her eyes, but also resolve. Kai, the one who'd been injured, was perhaps 30. Despite her limp, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She spoke the least of all of them, but when she did speak, it was worth hearing. Izusa was somewhere in her mid-20s, quick-witted and sharp. She'd been the one to organize most of the cleaning and cooking. Samuel suspected she was the practical one of the group, always thinking 3 steps ahead. And Nayeli, the youngest at maybe 20, had a gentle spirit that the hardships of their journey hadn't quite crushed. She hummed while she worked. She smiled at birds. She reminded Samuel painfully of his wife, who'd also found joy in small things. After dinner, they sat around the fire. For a while, no one spoke. Then Ione began telling a story. About her grandmother, who'd lived through the long walk, when thousands of Navajo had been forced to march hundreds of miles to a reservation. About suffering and survival. About how some stories need to be told so they're never forgotten. Izusa told a funnier story about catching a rabbit with her bare hands when she was 6, and how it had bitten her and escaped. Kai, quiet Kai, surprised them all by singing. Her voice was high and clear, a traditional song that made the hair on Samuel's arm stand up even though he didn't understand the words. When it was Samuel's turn, he hesitated. He hadn't told his story in 8 years. Hadn't said Mary's name out loud. Hadn't spoken about his son, who'd lived only 3 months. But he did now. Slowly, haltingly, he told them about the life he'd had and lost. About how the sickness came fast, took them both within days. About burying them on a hillside overlooking the ranch. About the years that followed, empty and endless. "I'm sorry," Ione said when he finished. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone." "Didn't know how to carry it any other way," Samuel admitted. "Maybe you don't have to carry it alone anymore." That night, Samuel actually slept in the house. He took a bedroll near the fireplace while the women shared the bedroom. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of other people breathing, of quiet whispers, of life happening around him. It should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt right. He woke before dawn, as usual. But instead of immediately beginning his chores, he stayed still, watching light creep through the windows. Ione stirred first, rose quietly, and began making coffee. She saw he was awake and nodded. They sat together in the pre-dawn dimness, drinking coffee, not speaking. Comfortable in the silence. "They'll come today," she said finally. "I can feel it." "Maybe," Samuel agreed. "We'll be ready. I want to tell you something. While we can." She set down her cup. "My husband, when he died, I thought I'd never trust a man again. The ones who killed him were men. The ones who drove us from our homes were men. The ones chasing us are men. I told myself that men only bring pain. And now? Now I'm sitting in a house with a man who risked everything for 4 strangers. Who stood up to 6 armed men without blinking. Who listened to my stories and shared his own." She looked at him directly. "You reminded me that people are individuals. That pain doesn't have to define us. That kindness isn't weakness. Samuel didn't know what to say. Emotions he'd buried for 8 years were surfacing, and he didn't know how to handle them. So he did what he'd always done. He stood up, put on his hat, and went to check the animals. But as he left, Ione called after him softly. "Thank you, Samuel. For everything." He paused at the door. "Thank you too." The morning passed tensely. Everyone waited, watching, listening for the sound of approaching horses. But noon came and went. Then afternoon. Samuel began to hope that maybe the marshals had given up. Maybe they'd decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Then, just as the sun started its descent, Azusa shouted from the window. "Riders! Coming from the west." Samuel grabbed his rifle. The women took their positions. They'd practiced this. Everyone knew what to do. He looked outside. More than 6 this time. He counted at least 10, maybe 12. They approached slowly, deliberately. Grayson rode at the front again, but this time he wasn't alone. A man in a fancier uniform rode beside him. Someone more senior. They stopped at the same distance as before. Grayson called out, "Samuel Bridger. We're back to complete our business." Samuel stepped onto the porch. "Told you to come back with a warrant." The senior officer spoke now. His voice was smoother, more educated. "Mr. Bridger, I'm Colonel Hendricks, Territorial Authority. I do have warrants. One for the apprehension of 4 Navajo fugitives. And one for your arrest on charges of obstruction and harboring. Let me see them. In due time. First, send out the women. This doesn't have to escalate. And if I don't?" Hendricks sighed. "Then we come in and take them. And you. Force will be used. People will be hurt. Is that what you want?" "What I want is for you to leave these women alone. They're not criminals. They're just people trying to stay free. Freedom isn't unlimited, Mr. Bridger. We all live under the rule of law." "Law?" Samuel's voice hardened. "Is it law that drives people from their homes? That puts them in camps where they die? That hunts them like animals? If that's your law, Colonel, then I don't recognize it. Your recognition isn't required." Behind Samuel, the door opened. Ione stepped out, followed by the others. They stood beside him, facing the mounted men. "Don't," Samuel said quietly. "Stay inside." "No," Ione replied. "If this ends today, we face it together." The other women nodded. Nayeli was frightened but resolute. Kai limped forward despite her injury. Azusa stood with her chin raised defiantly. Hendricks studied them. "Ladies, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Come peacefully. You'll be treated fairly. Like our families were treated?" Azusa shot back. "Like our neighbors? We know what happens in those camps. You're misinformed. The reservations are for your own." "Don't," Ione interrupted. "Don't insult us with lies. We're not children." The standoff stretched. Neither side willing to back down. The marshals outnumbered them significantly. They could rush the house, probably take it. But it would cost them. Samuel's rifle was aimed now, and the women held weapons too. In a fight, some of those marshals wouldn't go home. It was Hendricks who blinked first. "Grayson, Simmons, Taylor. Advance and apprehend." 3 marshals dismounted and started forward. Samuel raised his rifle higher. "Stop right there." They didn't stop. Samuel fired. Not at the men, but at the ground directly in front of them. Dirt exploded. The marshals jumped back. "Next one won't miss," Samuel promised. You're assaulting federal officers. Hendricks shouted. You're trespassing. I warned you. The colonel's face reddened. Take them. All of them. The marshals drew weapons. So did Samuel's group. For a moment, everything balanced on a knife's edge. One shot, one movement, and it would explode into violence. Then a new voice called out. Hold. Everyone turned. Another rider approached, this one alone, coming from the south. He wore no uniform, just trail clothes and a flat-brimmed hat. But something about him commanded attention. He rode between the two groups and dismounted. An older man, maybe 60, with a weathered face and steady eyes. Who the hell are you? Hendricks demanded. Judge Marcus Dalton, circuit judge for this district. He pulled papers from his saddlebag. I have jurisdiction here, Colonel. Hendricks looked confused. I wasn't informed of any judicial review. That's because I just arrived. Got word in town about a situation brewing. Thought I'd better come see for myself. He looked at Samuel. You Samuel Bridger? Yes, sir. And these are the 4 women in question? They are. The judge walked forward, stopping at the porch. He looked at each of the women carefully. You're Navajo? We are, Ioni confirmed. Running from reservation assignment? Running from death, she corrected. The judge nodded slowly. I've heard things. Bad things. About conditions at some of these camps. He turned to Hendricks. Let me see your warrants. The colonel handed them over reluctantly. The judge read them carefully, taking his time. Finally, he looked up. These are signed by Territorial Administrator Phillips. That's correct. Phillips was removed from office last week. Federal investigation into corruption and abuse of power. His orders are void. Hendricks went pale. I wasn't aware. Clearly. The judge handed back the papers. These warrants are worthless. And furthermore, I'm issuing an injunction against any forced relocation of Navajo peoples in this district until proper oversight can be established. Too many irregularities. Too many complaints. You can't. I can and I am. I suggest you and your men return to town, Colonel. This matter is concluded. For a moment, Hendricks looked like he might argue. But arguing with a circuit judge was a losing proposition. Finally, he jerked his head. Mount up. The marshals, looking confused and frustrated, obeyed. They rode off, leaving dust and tension behind. The judge watched them go, then turned back to Samuel and the women. That won't hold forever. Maybe a few months. But it gives you time. Time for what? Samuel asked. To figure out your next move. These women can't stay here permanently. It's too exposed. But maybe you can find somewhere safer. Somewhere they won't be hunted. He paused. Or maybe you can establish some legal protections. I know some people. Lawyers who might help. Why are you doing this? Ioni asked. The judge's expression was sad. Because 30 years ago, I enforced laws I shouldn't have. Did things I'm not proud of. And I told myself I was just following orders, doing my job. Took me too long to realize that's never a good enough reason. He looked at her directly. I can't undo the past. But maybe I can prevent some future wrongs. He mounted his horse. Good luck to all of you. You're going to need it. He rode away, leaving the 5 of them standing on the porch in stunned silence. Finally, Nayeli laughed. A slightly hysterical laugh, but genuine. Did that really just happen? I think so, Izusa said, equally amazed. Samuel lowered his rifle, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him shaky. Ione saw it and took his arm, steadying him. "Come inside," she said gently. "Before you fall over." They went in together. Someone made coffee. They sat around the fire, processing what had happened. They'd been saved, at least temporarily, by an unexpected ally. But the judge was right. This wasn't over. It had just been delayed. "We should leave," Kai said quietly. "Find somewhere else. We've put you in enough danger." "Where would you go?" Samuel asked. She had no answer. "Then stay. At least until we figure out a better plan." "Samuel. I mean it. Stay." He looked around at all of them. "This place has been dead for 8 years. A tomb for one man's grief. But these past weeks, it's come alive again. I've come alive again. I'm not ready to go back to how things were. Maybe I'm selfish for that, but there it is." Ione smiled. "Not selfish. Human." Over the following weeks, things settled into a new normal. The women weren't just guests anymore. They became part of the ranch, part of the rhythm of life there. Ione proved skilled with horses, taking over much of their training and care. Kai, once her ankle fully healed, turned out to be an excellent tracker and hunter. Izusa took charge of the garden, expanding it significantly and planting traditional crops. Nayeli worked with the chickens and started beekeeping, something Samuel had never considered. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Samuel found himself working alongside them, teaching and learning in equal measure. Ione showed him how to track animals using signs he'd never noticed. Kai taught him which desert plants were edible or medicinal. Izusa's garden produced more vegetables than they could eat. Nayeli's bees made the best honey Samuel had ever tasted. But more than the practical improvements, there was the simple fact of companionship. Meals were shared affairs now, with conversation and laughter. Evenings featured stories, songs, and sometimes just comfortable silence. The house felt full in a way Samuel had forgotten was possible. He still thought about Mary. Still visited her grave on the hillside. But the grief had changed. It was no longer the raw, consuming thing that had hollowed him out. It had become something gentler, more like a deep ache than a sharp pain. A part of him, but not all of him. One evening, about 6 weeks after the confrontation with the marshals, Samuel sat on the porch watching the sunset. Ione joined him, as she often did now. They'd fallen into the habit of these quiet moments together. "Tell me about your husband," Samuel said. It was the first time he'd asked. Ione was silent for a moment. Then she spoke. "His name was Ashkiai. Strong as a bear, gentle as rain. We had 20 good years together. 3 children, all grown now, scattered to other tribes." She paused. "When the soldiers came, he fought to protect our home. They shot him for it. Left him in the dirt while they burned everything we'd built. I'm sorry. So am I." She looked at him. "But I'm learning that sorrow doesn't have to be the end of the story. That there can be chapters after tragedy." Samuel nodded slowly. "I didn't think there could be. For 8 years, I was sure of it. And now? Now I'm not so sure." He met her eyes. "You and the others, you've changed something. In this place. In me." Ione reached over and took his hand. Her skin was warm, calloused from work, real. "You changed something for us too. You gave us hope when we'd almost lost it. Safety when we had none. A place to belong." They sat like that, hands joined, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep blue. Stars began to emerge, scattered across the vast darkness like seeds planted in dark soil. From inside came the sound of Nayeli singing while she worked. Izusa's laugh at something Kai said. The ordinary sounds of life being lived. I need to tell you something, Ione said quietly. The judge said his injunction would last a few months. It's been almost 2. Soon, the pressure will return. The government doesn't forget. They'll find new ways to come after us. I know. We've been talking, the 4 of us. About what to do. She squeezed his hand. There's a settlement, far north, near the Colorado border. Mostly Navajo and some sympathetic whites. They've managed to stay independent, off the reservation rolls. It's not easy, but it's free. Samuel felt his chest tighten. You're leaving. We might have to. Eventually. She turned to face him fully. But there's something else we discussed. A possibility. What? You could come with us. The words hung in the air. Samuel stared at her, stunned. Leave the ranch, he said finally. I know it's a lot to ask. This is your home. Your life. Your wife is buried here. Ione's voice was gentle but earnest. But you said yourself this place has been a tomb. Maybe it's time to leave the tomb. Start fresh somewhere new. I don't know if I can. You don't have to decide tonight. Just think about it. She stood, still holding his hand. But know this, Samuel Bridger. These weeks with you have meant more to me than I can properly say. When I thought my heart was closed forever, you opened it again. And I think maybe I did the same for you. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, soft and brief. Then she went inside, leaving Samuel alone with the stars and his thoughts. Sleep came hard that night. Samuel lay awake, mind churning. Leave the ranch? The idea seemed impossible. This land had been his entire adult life. Every fence post, every structure, built with his own hands. Mary was here, her grave marking the spot where his old life ended. But what life did he have if everyone left? Could he go back to the empty silence, the hollow routine, after experiencing what these weeks had brought? Could he bear to lose them, knowing he'd chosen solitude over connection? He thought of Ione. Of her strength and kindness. Of how natural it felt to sit beside her. How her presence made him want to be more than just a man surviving each day. He thought of the others too. Nayeli's gentle spirit. Izusa's sharp wit. Kai's quiet wisdom. They'd become family in a way he hadn't expected or planned for. By morning, he still hadn't decided. He went through his chores mechanically, barely speaking. The women noticed but gave him space, understanding he was wrestling with something. 3 more weeks passed. The injunction was surely running out. Everyone felt it, the approaching deadline. They began making preparations, gathering supplies, planning routes. But no one pushed Samuel for an answer. Then, one morning, riders appeared again. Not marshals this time. Just 2 men, traveling together. They stopped at a respectful distance and called out. Samuel Bridger? We're looking for Samuel Bridger. Samuel approached, wary. I'm Bridger. The lead rider dismounted. He was young, maybe 30, with an open, honest face. Mr. Bridger, my name is Thomas Webb. I'm an attorney from Santa Fe. Judge Dalton sent me. The judge? Yes, sir. He told me about your situation. About these women you're protecting. Webb pulled papers from his bag. I've been researching the legal situation. And I think I might have found something. They gathered around the kitchen table, all 6 of them. Webb spread out his documents. The territorial government has broad powers over tribal affairs, he explained. But there are exceptions. Specifically, there's an old statute that allows for individual Navajo to be granted territorial citizenship if they meet certain conditions. Property ownership, demonstrated self-sufficiency, and sponsorship by a recognized citizen. What does that mean? Azusa asked. It means if someone owned property and could sponsor you, vouch for your character and self-sufficiency, you could potentially be granted citizenship status, which would exempt you from forced relocation. Ayani frowned. Who would sponsor us? And we don't own property. Webb looked at Samuel. Well, that's what I wanted to discuss. Mr. Bridger owns this property. Substantial property. And he could sponsor you. I could? Yes. But there's a complication. Webb paused. The law was written with certain assumptions. It requires the sponsor to have a formal legal relationship with those he's sponsoring. Employer and employee. Or. He hesitated. Family. Family, Samuel repeated. Yes. The statute specifically mentioned sponsorship by family members. Spouses, children, siblings. The implication settled over the room slowly. Ayani spoke first. So you're saying? I'm saying that if Mr. Bridger were married to one of you, he could potentially sponsor all of you as extended family. The law is vague enough that a good judge might accept it. Silence. Complete silence. Finally, Samuel said, and would Judge Dalton be that good judge? Webb smiled. He would. In fact, he suggested this approach. More silence. Everyone carefully not looking at anyone else. This is ridiculous, Kai said finally. We can't ask Samuel to marry one of us just to. It's not ridiculous, Samuel interrupted. It's practical. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at his land. 8 years he'd been alone. 8 years of believing he'd never let anyone close again. And now here he was, contemplating marriage to a woman he'd known for less than 3 months. But was it really so sudden? He'd shared more with Ayani in these weeks than he'd shared with anyone in years. He'd felt things he thought were dead. Laughed. Cared. Lived. He turned back to the room. Ayani. She looked up, startled. Would you marry me? Everyone stared. Ayani's eyes widened. Samuel, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm asking if you would. He moved closer. These weeks together, they've meant something. To me at least. I don't know if it's love. Maybe it's too soon to call it that. But it's something real. Something I want to keep. Ayani stood slowly. You're sure? This isn't just for the law. If it was just for the law, I'd say so. But it's more than that. He took her hands. I'm asking because I want to. Because I think maybe we could build something together. Something good. Tears formed in Ayani's eyes. Then yes. Yes, I'll marry you. The room erupted. Nayeli squealed and hugged them both. Azusa wiped her own eyes. Kai smiled, a rare full smile. Webb looked pleased with himself. There's still work to do, the attorney cautioned once everyone calmed down. We'll need to file the papers, schedule the hearing. It'll take a few weeks. And there's no guarantee the territorial government won't challenge it. Let them challenge, Samuel said. We'll be ready. The wedding took place 1 week later. Judge Dalton came to the ranch to perform the ceremony. It was simple, held outside as the sun set. No fancy clothes, no decorations, just 6 people and a judge standing on desert soil. Samuel wore his cleanest shirt. Ayani wore a dress that Nayeli had spent 3 days embroidering with traditional patterns. The others stood witness, along with Webb and 2 townspeople he'd brought as additional legal witnesses. Do you, Samuel Bridger, take this woman to be your wife? The judge asked. Samuel looked at Ayani. Really looked at her. Saw the strength in her face, the kindness in her eyes, the life they might build together. I do. And do you, Ione, take this man to be your husband? Ione smiled. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I pronounce you husband and wife. They kissed, brief and gentle. And in that moment, something that had been broken in Samuel for 8 years finally, completely healed. The hearing came 3 weeks later. They traveled to Socorro together, all 5 of them plus Webb. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the case. Some people were sympathetic. Others were hostile, believing Samuel was flouting the natural order. The territorial attorney argued that this was a sham marriage, a legal trick to circumvent federal policy. He called it an abuse of the law, a mockery of legitimate procedures. Webb countered with careful legal arguments. Presented their marriage certificate. Brought witnesses to testify about Samuel's character and the women's integration into ranch life. Even called Judge Dalton himself, who testified that he'd observed genuine affection between Samuel and Ione. The hearing lasted 2 days. Finally, the judge, a stern older man named Harrison, rendered his verdict. This court finds that the marriage between Samuel Bridger and Ione is legally valid. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, Mr. Bridger's sponsorship of Ione's extended family members meets the requirements of Territorial Statute 47C. Therefore, Ione Bridger, Nayeli, Izusa, and Kai are hereby granted territorial citizenship status, with all rights and protections thereof. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Some cheered. Others shouted protests. But the verdict was final. They'd won. The trip back to the ranch was jubilant. Even Samuel, usually reserved, couldn't stop smiling. They were safe. Actually safe. The government couldn't touch them now, at least not legally. That night, they celebrated properly. Izusa cooked a feast. Nayeli played music on a flute she'd made. Kai told stories. Webb stayed for the meal, enjoying himself immensely before heading back to Santa Fe. As the night wore on and the others went to bed, Samuel and Ione found themselves alone by the fire. As husband and wife now, for real. Are you happy? Ione asked. Samuel considered the question. Yes, he said finally. I didn't think I'd ever be happy again. But I am. No regrets? None. He pulled her close. Well, maybe one. What? That I didn't meet you sooner. She laughed and kissed him. They sat together, watching the fire burn low, thinking about the future instead of the past. Life settled into new rhythms after that. Samuel and Ione shared the bedroom now, growing into their marriage day by day. The others continued their work, but with new confidence. They were citizens now. They had rights. They belonged. The ranch continued to thrive. Word spread about what Samuel had done, and it affected his reputation in Socorro. Some people shunned him, considering him a traitor to his race. But others respected him. A few even sought his advice about their own situations. 3 more Navajo families, facing forced relocation, asked if they could settle nearby. Samuel helped them find land and worked with Webb to establish similar legal protections. A small community began to form, scattered across the desert but connected by mutual support. By the end of summer, the ranch looked completely different. The house had been expanded. A new barn stood where the old one had rotted. Gardens flourished. Children played in the yard, children from the new families who'd settled nearby. One evening, Samuel stood on his porch looking out at it all. Ione joined him, as she always did. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About how much has changed," he said. 8 months ago, this place was a graveyard. Now it's alive. You're alive, she corrected. That's what matters. He put his arm around her. You know what's strange? I thought saving you that first day was me being charitable. Doing the right thing. But really, you saved me. We saved each other, Ayani said. That's what love does. Love. The word still felt new on his tongue. But it fit. What he felt for Ayani was love. Different from what he'd had with Mary, but no less real. And what he felt for the others, for this growing community, that was love too. A different kind, but equally vital. I want to show you something, he said. He led her away from the house, up the hillside as the sun set. They climbed to the top, where two graves lay under a twisted juniper tree. Mary and my son, Samuel said quietly. I haven't brought anyone here since they died. Ayani knelt, touched the stones gently. Thank you for sharing this with me. I wanted you to meet them. Or at least, to know about them. Samuel knelt beside her. I loved Mary. Part of me always will. But loving her doesn't mean I can't love again. Took me a long time to understand that. She'd want you to be happy. Ayani said. I think so too. He stood, helped Ayani up. But more than that, I think she'd approve of you. Of all of this. Mary believed in doing right, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. They stood together on the hill, watching the sun paint the desert in colors of fire and gold. Below them, smoke rose from chimneys. Voices carried on the wind, laughter and conversation. Life. I have something to tell you, Ayani said softly. What? I'm with child. Samuel froze. You're? Yes. About 2 months along. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. A child. Samuel's hands began to shake. After losing his son, he'd never imagined having another. Had never let himself hope for it. Are you all right? Ayani asked, seeing his reaction. He couldn't find words. Emotions overwhelmed him, joy and terror and wonder all mixed together. I'm going to be a father again. You are. He pulled her close, holding her as if she might disappear. I promise, he whispered. I promise I'll protect you both. No matter what. I know, she said. That's why I'm not afraid. They stayed on the hill until stars emerged. Then they walked down together, back to their home, back to their family, back to the life they were building together. Months passed. Ayani's pregnancy progressed smoothly. The community continued to grow. Samuel and the other men built more structures, dug wells, established proper boundaries. The women worked the land, taught the children, and kept everyone fed. It wasn't perfect. There were tensions sometimes. Disagreements about land use or resource allocation. Old prejudices didn't disappear overnight, and they faced hostility from some quarters. But they persevered. Webb visited regularly, helping with legal matters and becoming a friend. Judge Dalton stopped by occasionally, watching the community grow with satisfaction. Even Marshal Grayson, encountered by chance in town one day, grudgingly admitted that what Samuel had done was working. Don't mean I like it, he'd said. But it's legal. And it's peaceful. Can't argue with that. Winter came, milder than in other parts of the country but still cold for the desert. Everyone worked to ensure they had enough food and firewood. They helped each other, sharing resources, taking care of those who needed it. On a cold January morning, Ayani went into labor. Kai and Azusa attended her, along with an older Navajo woman from one of the other families who had experience with births. Samuel was banished to the porch, where he paced nervously with Nayeli. She'll be fine, Nayeli kept saying. Ayani is strong. I know, Samuel replied. But he remembered Mary's screams, remembered his son's brief life, and fear gnawed at him. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began to descend. Still, the labor continued. Then, finally, a cry. A baby's cry. Samuel stood frozen, afraid to hope. Kai appeared in the doorway, grinning. "You have a daughter. And she's perfect." Samuel rushed inside. Ioni lay in bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle. He approached slowly, almost reverently. "Meet your daughter," Ioni said. Samuel looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen. The baby opened her eyes, dark and unfocused, and grabbed his finger with surprising strength. "She's perfect," he breathed. "What should we name her?" Ioni asked. Samuel thought for a moment. "Mary," he said quietly. "For my first wife. And Ashkiai, for your husband. Mary Ashkiai Bridger." Ioni's eyes filled with tears. "That's perfect." They sat together, the new family, as others crowded around to see the baby. Nayeli cried happy tears. Izusa brought warm soup. Kai stood guard like a protective aunt. Samuel held his daughter and marveled at how much life could change. From despair to hope. From isolation to community. From death to new life. "Thank you," he whispered to Ioni. "For what?" "For finding me. For saving me. For giving me this." "We found each other," she corrected. "And we'll raise her together. Her and the others to come." "Others?" Ioni smiled tiredly. "You didn't think we'd stop at one, did you?" Samuel laughed, a full, free laugh. The kind he hadn't laughed in almost 9 years. "No, I suppose not." That night, as the household settled down and baby Mary slept in her mother's arms, Samuel sat by the fire. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The loss that had nearly destroyed him. The unexpected visitors who'd knocked on his gate. The choice he'd made to open it. He thought about all the other choices that had followed. To protect them. To fight for them. To marry Ioni. To build this community. Each choice had led to the next, creating a path he never could have imagined. And he thought about Mary, his first wife, buried on the hill. He liked to think she was watching somehow. That she approved. That she understood he wasn't replacing her but continuing on, living the life she would have wanted him to live. "I'm happy," he said aloud to the empty room. "I just wanted you to know. I'm finally happy." The fire crackled in response. And in the bedroom, his wife and daughter slept peacefully. Outside, the desert stretched for miles under a canopy of stars. The same desert that had been so empty and lonely 9 years ago. But it wasn't empty now. It was full of life, full of hope, full of possibility. And Samuel Bridger, the man who'd been dead inside for 8 years, the man who'd built walls to keep everyone out, was finally, completely alive. Years would pass. The community would grow. Mary would have siblings. Samuel and Ioni would grow old together, weathering storms and celebrating joys. There would be challenges still, threats external and internal. But they would face them as they'd faced everything else, together. But on that night, in that moment, all that mattered was the warmth of the fire, the sound of breathing from the next room, and the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The silent rancher had found his voice. And he'd used it to say yes. Yes to life. Yes to love. Yes to second chances. Yes to everything he thought he'd lost forever.